Today let's take a look at some of the basics of sculpting in ZBrush. So ZBrush is going to allow us to do some sculpting on polymesh objects. So what that means is that if we take a look at these 3D meshes here in our tool palette, if we want to start with one of these, let's go ahead and draw this onto the canvas, hit T to go to edit mode. We can't actually do any sculpting on this until we make it a polymesh. And we can do that by clicking this button right up here, which will actually make that a polymesh, and we can now do our sculpting. Okay, so just keep that in mind. If you're working with those primitives, you need to convert those to polymeshes. Otherwise, you can bring in OBJ files, other polymesh geometry, polygon geometry to be able to work with. Okay, so we'll just use this sphere as an example, and we'll add some subdivisions to this. And so go ahead and just add a few subdivisions here. Okay. And we'll just use the standard brush for now, so we won't worry about this too much. We'll talk a little bit about some of the information up here. So the first thing that we'll look at is the Z-add and Z-sub. And so the Z-add is going to allow us to pull detail out of our model. Z-sub will allow us to push in. Okay? Now we can alternate between these. For instance, if we have Z-add on, we can go ahead and do some sculpting here, and then by holding down Alt, we can go ahead and push into the surface. Same thing goes for having Z-sub on. We could have that on, and when we hold down Alt, it does the reverse. Okay, so you can really be very quick about doing your sculpting here. Okay, the Z intensity is basically how much that effect is applied. So if we take this way down to a very low intensity, go back to Z-add, you can see that it takes a lot of strokes to build that up. Okay, so you're getting a very subtle effect versus something that happened very quickly before. If we take that intensity all the way up to 100 and do the same stroke, you can see that we can get a very intense stroke there. Okay, now you see there are two red circles here. That's going to be your draw size and your focal shift. Okay, so if we take our draw size down, you can see how that red circle shrinks, and so we can get smaller strokes, okay, based on our draw size. We can also change the focal shift. So by taking that focal shift up, you can see how that smaller, the circle in the center gets much smaller. Okay, let's go to Z-add and we'll increase the draw size here. Versus taking that focal shift negative and pulling that center line out, you can see how it's very, very sharp. So it's kind of the blending from the center out for that stroke. Okay. Now we can also smooth detail by holding down Shift, which will go to whatever smooth brush we have selected. You can see that it's going to have its own independent settings here, but holding down Shift will allow us to smooth out that detail. Okay. So if we want to smooth that back out, you can do that. So you can very quickly change between pulling information out, pushing it in, and then smoothing it out just based on the keys that you hold down as you sculpt. So let's take a look at some of the brushes that we could use to actually sculpt. So we've looked at Z-add and Z-sub, so we want to make sure to have those on if we want to change the sculpting information here. Also playing with the draw size and the focal shift. But over here on our shelf, you can see that there are right now we have the standard brush chosen. If we click on this, we get a whole bunch of different brushes that we have available to us. Okay, a quick way, if you know the name of the brush that you're going to, you can actually hit, for instance, if I want to use the move brush, I can hit M, and then you can see that all these are assigned as another specific letter. So for instance, if I just want move, I would hit M and then the letter associated with this, B. So this gives me the move brush. Now with the move brush, instead of dragging a stroke across, I can click and drag to pull this detail out. Okay. We'll go back in here, and instead of clicking on this, we'll hit B to go to brushes. And so if you know the letter combinations, you can actually get through this very, very quickly. But we can go in here, we can use the clay buildup brush, and it will actually simulate the buildup of clay on your surface, and then we can go back in and kind of smooth that out if we want to. Okay. We have a number of different brushes, and we have courses on a lot of these different brushes. The planer brushes, the polish brushes are going to be really helpful. The clipping brushes are going to help you get some nice hard surfaces. We have brushes for slashing and strokes and seams and things like that. So there are a lot of different brushes, and all these are going to affect your model in slightly different ways. Let's go back to our standard brush. So I'll hit S and I'll hit T to go to standard. And so these brushes, when we apply these are applied using a different stroke. So the stroke is going to be located right underneath. And we also have palettes located up here. So brush, and then we also have a stroke palette here. But we can really access this quickly by hitting the stroke button. And so right now, you can see we have a dots stroke. We can choose how these strokes are actually added. So if we choose, for instance, a spray stroke, you can see how it's sort of spraying that across the surface. And if we have a drag dot, we're actually taking that one kind of dot stroke and we can move it around until it gets to the right spot. Okay? So definitely experiment with those. We also have alphas. So concentrate on the brush, the stroke, and the alpha. The alpha is going to kind of mask the shape of the brush. So in this case, let's say we want to create a shape that looks like that. So we can actually use this alpha to mask the brush. Now with the drag dot, it'll actually create something that looks like that. If we take the Z intensity down, we can change how that actually looks. We can see how that takes on the shape of the alpha based on the drag dot. If we use just our regular dot stroke, it creates a series of those in line. Okay. If we use the drag rectangle, we can actually click and drag out a copy of that onto our mesh. This becomes useful for if we have something like a dot pattern. We can kind of drag out a series of these dots for skin or something like that. Okay, but we can also use the color spray or the spray. Color spray will kind of create variation within the spray. We can also use the spray to kind of come in here and real quickly drag these across. We can change the draw size, take down the intensity there to get different effects. Okay, so you really want to concentrate on your brushes. So looking at the different brushes, your standard brush here is going to be the basic, and also applying an alpha, or I'm sorry, a stroke to define how that sculpting is actually happening across the surface, and then also defining an alpha to mask the actual shape of the brush. Okay, and you just want to make sure that Z add or Z sub is on, and you can alternate those with the Alt key. Check your Z intensity, and then you can also change your brush draw size and focal shift. And you want to make sure also that you're, of course, in edit mode and that you're working on a poly mesh. Okay, so those are the very basics of beginning to sculpt here in ZBrush. Of course, you can also go up and down your subdivision levels if you want to go ahead and use your move brush to move something at a lower level. You can certainly do that, and then bump that up and continue to work. And eventually, you end up with, if you're working on a character, you end up with something like this where you can get a lot of those wrinkles and details in there just using those different strokes and brushes and alphas. Okay, so make sure to check that out. The next thing that we want to look at is the basics of painting and texturing. So not only can we sculpt here in ZBrush, but we can also add different material looks, and also in the next lesson we'll look at actually painting color onto our polygons and textures. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that in the next lesson.